I remember the exact morning it started, because nothing about it made sense. A bright orange stake had been hammered into the middle of my land overnight. No note, no warning, just a thin ribbon tied to the top, flapping in the wind like a flag, claiming territory that wasn't theirs to claim. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe a survey crew mixed up lot numbers. Maybe a neighbor requested measurements, and the workers got confused. Small errors happen all the time, right? But mistakes don't usually multiply. By the end of that week, there were 5 more stakes. Then spray paint. Then tiny neon flags forming a crooked line across my property like someone was outlining a blueprint in real life. And then the email arrived. It was short, polite, almost cheerful. The HOA informed me that a community improvement project had been approved and construction would begin shortly. According to them, everything had gone through the proper channels. Everything was authorized. Everything was finalized. There was just one small problem. The project was being built on my land. I reread the email at least 10 times, waiting for the sentence that would explain the misunderstanding. It never came. No epaligi. No clarificación. Just a friendly reminder that construction crews might be arriving early in the morning and that residents should expect minor noise. Minor noise. 2 days later, the rumble of heavy machinery shook my windows before sunrise. When I stepped outside, half asleep and still holding my coffee, I saw workers unloading equipment onto my property like it had always belonged to them. Concrete mixers, wooden framing, survey markers now replaced with chalk lines and metal rods. A man in a hard hat waved at me like we were partners in this project. Morning. We're getting started today. Getting started on what? That was the moment the confusion turned into something heavier, something colder, because the crew wasn't hesitating. They weren't double-checking. They weren't asking for permission. They were completely confident they had it. Over the next few days, I made calls. I sent emails. I asked questions that somehow never received real answers. Every response sounded rehearsed, like someone reading from a script. Approved plans, signed documents, community benefit, long-term value. Each conversation ended the same way, polite, firm, and final. Construction continued. And here's the part nobody expected. I didn't try to stop them. I didn't block the machines. I didn't call the police. I didn't even step onto the construction site again. Instead, I stepped back and watched them build the entire thing from start to finish. Because what they didn't realize, what no one at the HOA realized, was that I had found something hidden deep in the paperwork. Something that changed everything. And by the time the project was finally complete, they had no idea what was coming next. The document was buried in a folder I hadn't opened in years. At first, I only went looking because I needed proof, something simple that said the land was mine and always had been. I expected to grab the deed, attach it to an email, and end the whole mess in a single afternoon. Instead, I fell into a paper trail that felt like stepping into a maze. My property sits at the edge of the neighborhood, right where the paved road turns into open land. When I bought it, everyone treated that strip like the neighborhood's unofficial boundary. Kids rode bikes up to the fence. Dog walkers turned around at the corner. Even the HOA newsletters always described the community as ending just before the open acreage. My acreage. I bought it years before the neighborhood ever existed. Back then, it was nothing more than quiet land and a long gravel driveway. No entrance signs, no committee meetings, no rule book about mailbox colors or grass height. Just space and silence. Then the development came. New houses appeared one by one. Roads expanded. Streetlights replaced the dark sky. Eventually, the HOA formed, and with it came welcome letters, friendly emails, and occasional reminders about community standards. For years, it stayed that way, slightly annoying, mostly harmless, easy to ignore. Until now, because as the construction on my land grew taller, louder, and more permanent, the tone of the HOA emails shifted. They stopped sounding friendly. They started sounding confident. Every message mentioned approved plans. Every call referenced signed agreements. One board member even told me, gently but firmly, that this project had been in discussion for years. Years. That sentence kept echoing in my head. How do you discuss building on someone's land for years without ever speaking to the owner? That question followed me back to the stack of documents spread across my dining table. Purchase agreements, old surveys, title insurance, property tax statements, papers I hadn't thought about since the day I signed them. And then I found the map. It was folded between two inspection reports, yellowed at the edges and marked with careful ink lines. Unlike the newer digital surveys, this one had handwritten notes in the margins. Notes about boundaries, access points, easements. That word stopped me. Easements. I'd heard it before, of course. Utility companies use them. Cities use them. Small slices of land granted for very specific purposes. Pipes, power lines, maintenance access. Temporary, limited, clearly defined. The document was buried in a folder I hadn't opened in years. At first, I only went looking because I needed proof, something simple that said the land was mine and always had been. I expected to grab the deed, attach it to an email, and end the whole mess in a single afternoon. Instead, I fell into a paper trail that felt like stepping into a maze. My property sits at the edge of the neighborhood, right where the paved road turns into open land. When I bought it, everyone treated that strip like the neighborhood's unofficial boundary. Kids rode bikes up to the fence. Dog walkers turned around at the corner. Even the HOA newsletters always described the community as ending just before the open acreage. My acreage, I bought it years before the neighborhood ever existed. Back then, it was nothing more than quiet land and a long gravel driveway. No entrance signs, no committee meetings, no rule book about mailbox colors or grass height. Just space and silence. Then the development came. New houses appeared one by one. Roads expanded. Streetlights replaced the dark sky. Eventually, the HOA formed, and with it came welcome letters, friendly emails, and occasional reminders about community standards. For years, it stayed that way, slightly annoying, mostly harmless, easy to ignore. Until now, because as the construction on my land grew taller, louder, and more permanent, the tone of the HOA emails shifted. They stopped sounding friendly. They started sounding confident. Every message mentioned approved plans. Every call referenced signed agreements. One board member even told me, gently but firmly, that this project had been in discussion for years. Years. That sentence kept echoing in my head. How do you discuss building on someone's land for years without ever speaking to the owner? That question followed me back to the stack of documents spread across my dining table. Purchase agreements, old surveys, title insurance, property tax statements, papers I hadn't thought about since the day I signed them. And then I found the map. It was folded between two inspection reports, yellowed at the edges and marked with careful ink lines. Unlike the newer digital surveys, this one had handwritten notes in the margins. Notes about boundaries, access points, easements. That word stopped me. Easements. I'd heard it before, of course. Utility companies use them. Cities use them. Small slices of land granted for very specific purposes. Pipes, power lines, maintenance access. Temporary, limited, clearly defined. I unfolded the map further, smoothing the creases with my hands. A thin line traced the edge of my property near the road. Next to it, in small handwriting, were words that made my stomach drop. Conditional community access easement. Conditional, not permanent, not transferable. Conditional. The room felt suddenly quiet, like the air had changed. Outside, I could still hear the distant grind of construction equipment, the beep of reversing trucks, the rhythm of hammers echoing across the land. The project was moving fast now. Framing had gone up. Concrete had been poured. Whatever they were building, it wasn't temporary. It was meant to stay. I read the note again, and again, each time slower. Conditional community access easement, subject to original landowner approval and active use agreement. Original landowner. Approval. Active agreement. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling while the realization settled in piece by piece. Somewhere along the way, the HOA had convinced themselves that access meant ownership. That approval had already been granted. That time had erased the conditions written in ink. but there was no approval. There had never been an agreement. And if the conditions weren't met, the easement didn't hold. For the first time since the machines arrived, the confusion began to fade. In its place came something steadier, colder, a slow understanding that this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a mistake that had grown into a full construction project, a very expensive one. And the more I read, the clearer it became that the HOA had built their entire plan on a single assumption, that no one would ever look closely enough to challenge it. Outside, another truck pulled up, more materials unloaded, more progress. They were getting close to finishing, which meant the moment I'd been quietly preparing for was getting closer too. Because once the last nail was hammered in, everything was going to change. I unfolded the map further, smoothing the creases with my hands. A thin line traced the edge of my property near the road. Next to it, in small handwriting, were words that made my stomach drop. Conditional community access easement. Conditional, not permanent, not transferable. Conditional. The room felt suddenly quiet, like the air had changed. Outside, I could still hear the distant grind of construction equipment, the beep of reversing trucks, the rhythm of hammers echoing across the land. The project was moving fast now. Framing had gone up. Concrete had been poured. Whatever they were building, it wasn't temporary. It was meant to stay. I read the note again, and again, each time slower. Conditional community access easement, subject to original landowner approval and active use agreement. Original landowner. Approval. Active agreement. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling while the realization settled in piece by piece. Somewhere along the way, the HOA had convinced themselves that access meant ownership. That approval had already been granted. That time had erased the conditions written in ink. But there was no approval. There had never been an agreement. And if the conditions weren't met, the easement didn't hold. For the first time since the machines arrived, the confusion began to fade. In its place came something steadier, colder, a slow understanding that this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a mistake that had grown into a full construction project, a very expensive one. And the more I read, the clearer it became that the HOA had built their entire plan on a single assumption, that no one would ever look closely enough to challenge it. Outside, another truck pulled up, more materials unloaded, more progress. They were getting close to finishing, which meant the moment I'd been quietly preparing for was getting closer too. Because once the last nail was hammered in, everything was going to change. By the time the framing turned into walls, the entire neighborhood knew something was happening on my land. People slowed their cars when they drove past. Dog walkers paused longer than usual. Conversation stopped when I stepped outside to grab the mail. Curiosity was spreading faster than the construction itself. And that's when the first neighbor came to talk to me. It was late afternoon, the sun dipping low enough to turn the half-finished structure gold. I was standing at the fence line, watching workers install railings, when a voice behind me said, "It's going to be beautiful." I turned and saw Mrs. Alvarez from 3 houses down. She smiled the way people do when they assume you're proud of something. "They said it'll really bring the community together," she continued. "We've needed this for years. Needed this." I forced a polite smile and asked what she meant. "A shared recreation space," she said. "Walking path, seating area, maybe even a small playground. The HOA has been talking about it forever. They finally got approval." Approval. That word again. Her excitement was genuine. Warm. The kind that comes from believing something good is happening. And for the first time, the situation twisted into something more complicated than paperwork and boundaries. Because the people living around me weren't villains. They were excited neighbors who believed this project was a gift. Over the next few days, more conversations followed. A young couple pushing a stroller told me they couldn't wait for evening walks there. A retiree said the benches would be perfect for morning coffee with friends. Someone mentioned property values rising. Every interaction added weight to the silence I'd been keeping. And with each passing day, a quiet question started growing in the back of my mind. What happens when taking back what's yours hurts people who never meant harm? It would have been easier if the HOA had been openly aggressive. Easier if they'd ignore me completely. But they didn't. They kept emailing. Invitations to community update meetings. Progress photos. cheerful newsletters celebrating milestones. My inbox filled with phrases like shared benefit, neighborhood unity, and exciting improvements. They never mentioned my name. Not once. It was as if the land had quietly transformed into a blank space in their narrative, a piece of a neighborhood that had always belonged to everyone. Meanwhile, construction accelerated. Landscaping trucks arrived. Fresh soil replaced wild grass. Young trees appeared in neat rows, staked upright with careful precision. A curved path snaked through the center of the property, already hinting at the finished design. The place was starting to look inviting. And that's when the second complication arrived. A certified letter. Unlike the cheerful emails, this envelope felt heavy before I even opened it. Inside was a formal notice from the HOA board reminding me of community compliance expectations and thanking me for my cooperation during the construction process. Cooperation. They believed my silence meant agreement. I read the letter twice, then a third time, noticing the subtle shift in tone. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't friendly either. It carried the quiet confidence of people who believed the outcome was already decided. For a moment, doubt crept in. Had waiting been the wrong choice? The project was nearly finished now. Concrete cured, railings installed, trees planted. The place looked less like a construction site and more like a permanent part of the neighborhood. Stopping it now would feel very different than stopping it weeks ago. Now it would feel like taking something away. That realization sat heavy in my chest that night as I walked the edge of the property under the dim glow of streetlights. The air smelled like fresh wood and damp soil. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The neighborhood felt calm, settled, peaceful, and yet every step along the fence line reminded me of the documents waiting on my dining table. The conditions, the signatures, the missing approval. I stopped near the entrance they'd built, a wide opening in the fence that led directly from the sidewalk onto the new path. It was designed to feel welcoming, effortless, like the space had always been meant for everyone. A small sign lay on the ground nearby, still wrapped in plastic. I could just make out the words through the packaging. Community Greenway. They already had a name for it. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My thoughts kept circling the same uneasy truth. The longer this continued, the more complicated the ending would become, and the more people would be caught in the middle. Because somewhere between the paperwork and the pouring of concrete, this had stopped being a simple property dispute. It had turned into a story the entire neighborhood believed in, which meant when the truth finally surfaced, it wasn't just going to surprise the HOA. It was going to shock everyone. The sign went up on a Saturday morning. I watched from my kitchen window as two workers unwrapped the plastic and anchored it into the ground beside the new entrance. The posts slid into fresh concrete, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Community Greenway. Seeing the name standing upright on my land made everything feel suddenly real. Permanent. Official. Like the story the neighborhood believed had finally become fact. By noon, people were already using it. A couple walked the curved path slowly, hands brushing. Kids ran ahead of their parents, testing the smooth pavement with the kind of excitement reserved for something brand new. Someone sat on one of the benches with a coffee cup and their phone, like they'd been doing it for years. Not even cooking. No grand opening. They just started living in it. And the HOA emails shifted again. This time the subject line read, Opening Celebration. I stared at the message longer than I meant to. The invitation was bright, cheerful, full of exclamation points and smiling language about unity and shared spaces. There would be snacks, photos, speeches, a small ceremony to celebrate the completion of the neighborhood's newest amenity. The date was circled in bold. 1 week away. My phone buzzed before I even finished reading. It was a neighbor this time, the young couple with the stroller. Hey, are you going to the opening next Saturday? You should come. Everyone's excited. Everyone. I typed a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. Eventually, I sent something vague and polite that said I might stop by. Might, because the truth was the date on that invitation had already been circled on my calendar for a very different reason. That morning, I finally called the number on the old paperwork. The title company transferred me twice before connecting me with someone who sounded surprised the file even existed. There was a long pause while she pulled up the records. I could hear typing, papers shuffling, the quiet hum of an office somewhere far away. Then she said the words that made my grip tighten on the phone. Yes, the easement is still conditional. Still, I asked her to repeat it. She did, slower this time. The easement had never been converted into a permanent agreement. No updated documents. No recorded approval. No legal transfer of usage rights. Nothing had changed since the day the ink dried years ago. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear her next sentence. If the conditions were never met, the access can be revoked. Revoked. Such a small word. Soft. Almost harmless. But it echoed in my head like thunder. I thanked her, hung up, and sat in silence while the reality settled over me. Outside, laughter drifted from the path. Someone's shoes crunched softly on gravel. A child shouted in excitement. The space was alive now, and I knew exactly what that meant. Taking it back wouldn't stop construction. Construction was finished. Taking it back would stop everything else. That afternoon, a second call went out. This one shorter, more direct. A consultation appointment scheduled for early next week, 3 days before the opening celebration. The timing wasn't lost on me. By Sunday evening, the HOA sent another reminder email. Final details, parking suggestions, a note about the unveiling speech from the board president. They were confident, completely confident. I imagined the speech already written, the applause, the photos posted online, the story told over and over about how the neighborhood came together to create something beautiful. A finished story, a happy ending. They had no idea another ending was quietly approaching from a completely different direction. Tuesday arrived faster than expected. I walked into the office carrying a folder thick with documents, deeds, surveys, emails, the old map with the handwritten note that had started everything. The lawyer flipped through the pages slowly, quietly, occasionally nodding, occasionally pausing to reread a line. Minutes stretched into an hour. The silence in the room felt heavier than any conversation. Finally, he closed the folder. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just leaned back in his chair and asked one question. Do you want to stop this before the opening or after? The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Before or after? Outside, somewhere in the neighborhood, someone was probably walking the path right now, enjoying the shade of newly planted trees, sitting on benches that weren't supposed to be there. I thought about the invitation email waiting in my inbox, the speeches being prepared, the celebration already planned. I thought about the sign standing proudly at the entrance. Community Greenway. I took a slow breath, because the next decision wouldn't just change the project. It would change everything that came after. And the clock was ticking. I didn't answer the lawyer right away, before or after. The question followed me home, sat beside me at dinner, echoed through the house long after the lights were off. Every version of the future played out differently depending on that single decision. Stop the opening, or let the celebration happen first. By morning, I thought I knew what I was going to do. Then the second envelope arrived. It was hand-delivered. No stamp, no return address. Just my name written across the front in careful block letters. Inside was a printed packet clipped together with a sticky note on top. You deserve to see this. That was it. No signature. My stomach tightened before I even turned the first page. The document looked familiar immediately. HOA letterhead, board meeting minutes, formatted neatly with bullet points and dates. I skimmed the first paragraph, expecting updates about landscaping or event planning. Instead, I saw my address, bolded, followed by a sentence that made the room feel smaller. Legal ambiguity regarding boundary ownership unlikely to be challenged by current landholder. I read it again, slower this time. Unlikely to be challenged. The next page listed projected costs, budget approvals, contractor bids, a timeline stretching back nearly 2 years. Every stage of the project mapped out long before the first survey stake ever appeared on my property. They hadn't made a mistake. They had made a calculation, a cold, quiet assumption that I wouldn't fight back. I kept reading. There were notes from board discussions, concerns about purchasing nearby land being too expensive, suggestions about underutilized edge acreage, a line about how a greenway would dramatically improve neighborhood value and perception. And then the sentence that landed hardest of all: proceed unless legal opposition emerges. Unless. The word sat on the page like a ticking clock. The room felt silent, but my thoughts were loud and fast and messy. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't paperwork lost in a filing cabinet. This had been a risk assessment, a gamble, a decision made in a conference room by people who believed they understood the odds. And the worst part, they were almost right, because for weeks I hadn't stopped them. Idibatcha. Waited. Let the concrete dry. The realization twisted into something heavier than anger, something closer to betrayal. Not loud or explosive, just deep and steady. Someone inside the HOA had sent this to me, quietly, secretly, without putting their name on it, which meant not everyone agreed with what had happened. And suddenly the story had two timelines running side by side. In one timeline, the HOA board was preparing speeches and celebration banners, confident their biggest project was about to become their proudest achievement. In the other timeline, I was sitting in my kitchen table holding proof that the project had been built on a calculated risk. Two stories racing toward the same Saturday morning. My phone buzzed, pulling me back to the present. Another HOA email. Final reminder. Final schedule. A cheerful countdown to the opening ceremony. 3 days away. I opened the calendar and stared at the square marked with the event. For weeks, I had imagined confronting them quietly. A legal notice. A private meeting. A conversation behind closed doors. That plan suddenly felt outdated. Too small. Because now there was a new question layered on top of the old one. Not just before or after, but how? How do you confront a room full of people celebrating something they believe is permanent? How do you tell neighbors who already love a place that it was never theirs to begin with? Outside, footsteps crunched along the path again. Laughter drifted through the open window. The space felt alive in a way empty land never had. And for a moment, the moral weight of it all pressed down hard. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about trust, about assumptions, about a decision made years ago in a meeting room that was finally about to collide with reality. Saturday was coming fast. The speeches were written. The ribbon was ready. And now, for the first time, I knew something they didn't. Someone on the inside had just tipped the scales, which meant the ending wasn't going to happen quietly anymore. Saturday arrived bright and warm, the kind of morning that makes everything feel hopeful, whether you want it to or not. By the time I walked toward the entrance, the path was already full. Folding tables lined the grass with snacks and paper cups. Kids darted between benches. Neighbors stood in clusters, laughing, pointing, taking photos beside the new sign like tourists visiting a landmark. The HOA board stood near the front, wearing matching smiles and carefully casual outfits. The board president held a stack of note cards, tapping them lightly against his palm as he greeted people. No one noticed the folder under my arm. I stayed near the back of the crowd while the speeches began. Thank yous. Gratitude. Words like community, vision, future. Applause rose and fell like waves. Cameras clicked. Someone passed out little green ribbons. Then the board president stepped forward to the small podium they'd set up beside the sign. He talked about years of planning, about perseverance, about how this project proved what a neighborhood could accomplish when everyone worked together. Work together. The words echoed louder than the microphone. And today, he said, smiling wide, we celebrate a space that belongs to all of us. Applause broke out before he finished the sentence. That was my cue. My feet felt heavier than usual as I stepped forward, weaving gently through the crowd. Conversations softened as people noticed the folder in my hands. The board president's smile faltered just slightly when he saw me approach the front. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't rush. I just waited until the applause faded. Hi, I said. I think we need to pause for a moment. The silence spread slowly, like ripples across water. Curious faces turned toward the stage. Someone stopped mid-laugh. The board president leaned toward the microphone, unsure whether to speak or step aside. I held up the folder. I'm the owner of the land this was built on. You could feel the shift in the air. Confusion first, then disbelief, then the quiet realization that this wasn't part of the program. I explained the easement, the conditions, the missing approval, the calls, the documents. Each sentence landed heavier than the last. No accusations, no shouting, just facts. When I finished, the silence felt enormous. The board president looked stunned, flipping through the copies I handed him with shaking hands. One of the other board members whispered something urgently. The confident smiles from earlier had disappeared completely. What does this mean? Someone in the crowd asked. I took a slow breath. It means the easement was never activated. Legally, this land was never transferred for community use. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Confusion turned into shock. People looked at the benches, the trees, the winding path beneath their feet, as if seeing them for the first time. And then I said the sentence I'd rehearsed 100 times. I'm revoking access to the property. Gasps. A few quiet protests. A child asking a parent what was happening. The board president stepped toward me, voice low and strained. We can fix this. We can work something out. And that was the moment the story could have turned into a fight. But it didn't, because I opened the folder again and pulled out the last document. A contract. Brand new. Signed the day before. I already did. The crowd fell silent again. I explained how the past week had unfolded. Meetings, negotiations, long conversations that stretched late into the evening. How the HOA had seen the documents, the meeting minutes, the risk they'd taken. How the numbers changed when the mistake became real. They hadn't lost the Greenway. They had purchased it. Fairly. Legally. Officially. The twist rippled through the crowd in real time. Shock softened into relief. Murmurs turned into laughter. Someone actually clapped. The board president stared at the contract like it might disappear if he blinked. You sold it to us. I nodded. At market value. With proper approval this time. The tension broke like a held breath finally released. Shoulders relaxed. Conversations sparked back to life. The same space that had felt fragile minutes ago suddenly felt grounded again. But the real twist came last. I reached into the folder one more time and pulled out a small framed copy of the original map, the one with the handwritten note that had started everything. I have one condition, I said. The crowd leaned in. The entrance sign stays exactly where it is. The board president blinked. Confused. Why? I smiled just a little. Because underneath the new sign, there's room for a second one. The new plaque would read, land donated to the community by its original owner after purchase. Not given. Not taken. Chosen. The applause this time felt different. Warmer. Real. And as the ribbon was finally cut, the Greenway didn't feel like a mistake anymore. It felt like a story the neighborhood would tell for years. In the weeks after the ribbon cutting, the Greenway settled into the rhythm of everyday life. The crowds disappeared first, then the folding tables. The excitement softened into routine. Morning walkers, evening joggers, quiet conversations on benches under the young trees that were already beginning to take root. For the first time since the construction started, the land felt calm again. Only now, it felt shared in a way that didn't feel forced. The HOA kept their word. Within days, the new plaque appeared beneath the entrance sign. It was simple, brushed metal, easy to miss unless you stopped and looked closely. But people did stop. I saw it happen over and over. Someone would pause mid-walk, lean closer, read the small lines, and then glance around the space differently, as if the story of how the Greenway came to exist changed the way the place felt beneath their feet. Ownership had quietly turned into partnership, and the neighborhood changed in small, unexpected ways. The board members who once sounded rehearsed in emails started sounding human. Updates became conversations instead of announcements. Meetings opened with questions instead of conclusions. The polished confidence was gone, replaced by something more careful and more honest. One evening, a handwritten note appeared in my mailbox. No envelope this time. No misteri. Just a short message from a board member who admitted they'd been the one to send the anonymous packet. They wrote that they couldn't stop the project back then, but they couldn't stay silent either. They ended the note with a simple sentence: "Thank you for giving us a way to fix it." I kept that note because it answered a question that had lingered quietly since the day the second envelope arrived. The neighborhood had never been one group versus another. It had been a collection of people moving at different speeds toward the same realization. Mistakes happen slowly, but accountability can happen just as slowly too. Neighbors still stop me sometimes when I walk the path. They thank me for the space, even though they now know the full story. Parents talk about how often their kids ask to visit the greenway. A retiree once told me the bench near the entrance had become part of his morning routine. Each conversation carries the same quiet understanding. This place almost began as a conflict and ended as a choice. And that choice changed me too. For weeks, I'd wrestled with the idea of taking the land back completely, locking the gate, restoring the silence that existed before the neighborhood expanded around it. It would have been simpler, cleaner, easier to explain. But standing on the path now, watching strangers become neighbors in real time, I understand why the decision never felt simple. Because sometimes the real victory isn't proving you're right. It's deciding what to do with that truth once you have it. The greenway lights flicker on each evening just before sunset. Soft, warm pools of light stretching along the curved path. The same path that once felt like a line being drawn without permission now feels like a connection running through the heart of the neighborhood. And every time I pass the entrance, I glance at the two signs standing side by side. One celebrating the space, the other quietly telling the story behind it. Both true. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's one that took me months to understand. Standing up for what's yours doesn't always mean taking it away. Sometimes it means making sure the story ends differently than it began. So if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or pushed aside by decisions made without you, remember this: your voice still matters, even if you use it later than you wish you had. And when the moment comes to choose between conflict and resolution, the strongest move might be the one nobody expects. If this story made you think, share it with someone who believes in fairness, community, and second chances. Because the best neighborhoods aren't built by perfect decisions. They're built by people willing to make things right.